So I'm going to give a talk that's a hybrid of the talk I give around my book, which is big global issues, and then a hybrid between that and a very focused talk on urban water science. That's what I think got me invited here. There's folks in the room, Betsy and others, who are very focused on urban water supplies, sustainability. So I'm going to try to give you some scientific meat there in that part of the talk. So I wanted to start with the Earth at night from space and the big urban context we find ourselves in. And many of you may know this story, but we're in the middle of the biggest human migration in history. Right? More than 2 billion folks will be, additional folks will be in cities by 2050. To get your head around how big a number that is, picture everything you know in DC, all the roads and bridges and developments. So picture building that in about a week, and then doing that again and again and again up to 2050. That's the pace of development we're going through. Another way to get your head around how big a change this is, the projections are that if you push all that new urban development together, we're going to urbanize an area the size of the state of Texas. So for ecologists and conservationists, which is where I come from, that's a really fundamental transformation of the Earth's land surface, and you have to think about that. And I want to put out there a quote that Bill McKibben put out there 20 plus years ago now. Bill McKibben wrote about this idea of the end of nature. So what he meant by that was every ecosystem process was affected by people, at least through climate change, and probably in other ways. So we're heading into the urban world, and in a sense, cities might be, from that perspective, McKibben's perspective, the death of nature, right? These are totally created spaces. We've designed them for ourselves and for our species. I will speak today some to that perspective, but I also want to speak from a different perspective as someone who lives in cities and thinks, hopes, wants to believe that nature and nature conservation has a role to making our urban century more sustainable and more secure. So this is just to give you a visual of what that process has looked like over time. The US and Europe in many ways are ahead of where the rest of the world is going. Much of this urban growth will be in China, India, parts of Africa, but even in the US where we're sitting, substantial urban growth challenges. So I think I gave you the layout of what I'm going to do. I'll speak first from this perspective of conserving nature from cities. What's the state of the field for conservation biologists? How much of this are we going to do in the future? And then I'm going to shift to this other perspective of conserving nature for cities. The person, you in your intro, talked about natural infrastructure, this bit of jargon. This is more and more my job at the Nature Conservancy, so I want to talk about this new field with a special deep dive on source watershed protection and urban water. And then I'll return back to McKibben's phrase and is an urban world the end of nature? How do we react to that as an environmental movement, which is where I'm coming from. So I fell in love with conservation in a place like this. I'm from North Carolina. This is the Green Swamp in North Carolina. And so I fell in love with nature going out and measuring plants. I was a plant ecologist first and foremost. And these systems are really cool. So you can measure in a square meter 100 different species of grasses. Very diverse systems. And there was a certain specific moment I got into urban ecology and urban planning. I was getting paid by the state of South Carolina to survey the last population of this little diminutive plant in South Carolina. The state natural heritage program had just spent a lot of money to protect this one parcel. And on one side was a parking lot for a car dealership, I think, and on two of the other sides were low-density residential housing sprawling out from a southern town. And I remember thinking, this species is a god, right? But if I want to do something in this field, I should understand why the cities are growing the way they are and how you could more smartly plan for urban growth. So we can call that conservation from cities, and you have to do it if you're a conservation group, just because it's a significant threat. So 1 in 4 species in the US that are in peril are in metro regions. Globally, that figure is a little lower, but cities are probably related to about 10% of impairment globally. And so conservation NGOs like TNC, which was first and foremost the land trust, end up protecting places like this that at least aren't far from cities. This is the Potomac River Gorge. Bear Island and some of the inholdings there were privately held for a long time, and they were slated to become actually a hotel, kind of a luxury hotel. And so we worked with the Park Service to protect those and transfer it over to the Park Service. That's kind of classic conservation work. And if you're going to urbanize an area the size of the state of Texas, TNC will have to keep doing some of that. And I think the good news from the perspective of science is this is a well-known, well-studied challenge. I was talking before the talk with someone who worked with Hugh Possingham, who's our new chief scientist. And Hugh made his whole career out of building tools that help you plan to protect biodiversity against a set of threats, including urban development. And the cartoon solution looks a little bit like this, so excuse the crudeness of the cartoon. So this is like some ocean, the polka dots are cities, I don't know why I made a polka dot. And the gray area is some natural habitat. So the conclusion is often you want fairly large patches of natural habitat if you can, because that limits edge effects, it limits the ecological alteration of the patch. And then you want corridors if you can. So you have some connection for species that are mobile between them. So notice that the goal here is, whether it's conservation in cities or from cities, you want to protect that habitat from the bad people who might affect it. You want to maintain its ecological practices. So this is the LA River. I'm transitioning now to this other perspective. LA River is the poster child for an altered ecosystem. And yes, this was really bad for the fish in LA River to use it as essentially a stormwater drain. But it's also, I would argue, really bad for the people who live in Los Angeles. This is a gray, depressing landscape. So I think I work at the Nature Conservancy. A lot of my fellow employees are very depressed when I talk about this urban future, and it's because they're imagining a future of more of these, right? So if the area the size of the state of Texas looks like that, that's a really depressing future for conservationists. But yet, you're also seeing this interesting trend in cities to try to recreate spaces like this. This is a project in downtown Seoul. This is, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, so if anyone speaks Korean, I'm sorry. This is the Cheonggyecheon River, which used to look worse than the LA River. So there was a highway on top of the river, and they launched a very large project to make it look like this. So this is not nature the way Bill McKibben would talk about nature with a capital N, right? These are human choices about which species to plant. There was some landscape architect who designed this. Now there's ecological function in this design. This has to hold floodwater from the river, so it's essentially the 100-year floodplain of the city. They're trying to filter some of the water. They're trying to provide other ecosystem services in the sense that this is a park, people go walk here, they jog here. So we call that nature with a small n. But it's still a fundamental change, right, to the core of the city. And more in my job, and in the job of ecologists, we're getting asked to think about using nature this way, what you might call conservation for cities. This idea of what are the different ways nature or natural infrastructure can provide benefits. So this is my cartoon of that. So the actual form is going to depend on the ecosystem service you're providing. But often, you have to provide that service close to where people live and where they work, right? So if you're thinking about shade trees and how they're going to provide shade for a city, they have to be right next to homes, for example. So if you want to provide recreational space, so you're fighting obesity, which is something some city leaders are interested in, you also want to increase access. So in a sense, the strategy here is opposite. You want to increase interaction with the patches. And so there is an interesting tension that I see in my day-to-day job at the Conservancy. We often are working with cities on their broad open space plan. And so at the far suburbs, you're thinking about biodiversity protection, large patches of mostly natural habitat. And then for some ecosystem services, you're thinking about street trees or constructed spaces like that river in Seoul that are not primarily about biodiversity, they're for other reasons. So different goals give you a different spatial pattern. All right, I'm going to jump in here to a discussion of Quito, Ecuador, which is one of the first places where the Nature Conservancy worked on source water protection in Latin America. This work was very much inspired by the New York City story, which probably all of you know. This idea that instead of building a bigger water treatment plant, they could help protect their source watershed. And one of our, actually kind of an intern in New York City, went back to Ecuador and started up a project kind of inspired by that, because Quito faced a similar sort of challenge. Above them is the Paramo, so this high altitude grassland. Very biodiverse system in terms of birds, especially. So you have to picture Andean condor sort of flying around here. That's what drew the Nature Conservancy to work here. But our staffers in the city also realized that there was this direct connection between their drinking water and what was happening upstream. Essentially, there was greater agricultural development upstream, and that was increasing sediment load and some pollutants into the city's water treatment plant, which they still only lightly treat compared to some cities. So the choice was that sort of gray versus green classic choice. And they did a little bit of both, but they chose in the end to put aside 2% of their water revenues a year into kind of an endowment that then funds conservation activities in their source watersheds. So there are multiple stakeholders in that committee, the water fund that decides how water is spent. So this is not a pure payment for ecosystem services scheme. Within WRI, there's been a lot of academic work on more pure payment for ecosystem services. Here, there's often more in-kind support or development projects that are helping rural communities, but that are supposed to also have a water quality benefit. So this is the cartoon of why you need that. Most water infrastructure globally is designed when the watershed is in a more pristine state, or at least there's some natural land cover, like forest. And over time, as you have more human activity, that increases sediment loads, it increases pollution, it affects the operation and maintenance costs and the capital costs if you try to increase your complexity of treatment. I worked for several years on this project where we tried to map water supplies for about 500 big cities globally. Where are they getting their water from? And we've recently been trying to reconstruct this timeline of land use in those watersheds. And it's really striking. About 90% of the world's source watersheds have had some significant level of degradation over time. So population densities have gone up, agriculture has gone up. So if you're a city globally, essentially all of them are facing, 90% of them are facing some transition like this. And 14C as well, this all matters because these are statistics from World Wildlife Fund, their Living Planet Index. Freshwater biodiversity is more threatened than terrestrial. So we've been working so much in this source watershed protection space because we're hoping that we get this conceptual sort of win-win-win, right? It's the holy grail, and it doesn't always work that way, but often investments by cities in source watershed protection improve their water security and can help with both terrestrial and freshwater biodiversity. That's the value proposition, at least. This is just to give you a sense that a lot of my job is not talking about this in the abstract, but talking about this in very specific places. So TNC works on this in a number of places. There's about 22 operating water funds and another 30 or so that are in development. So growth area for the Conservancy, we've mobilized about $300 million for conservation, which is big in one sense, although it's quite small compared with the global cost of treating and delivering water to cities is probably in the neighborhood of tens of billions a year, right? So you have to keep that number in context. And of course, we do this work with lots of partners, and in fact, WRI is now working with us on some of this work in Brazil. So a number of partners involved. So I want to take a second and unpack this term source watershed conservation, because it's actually a number of discrete strategies. At least this is how we think of it at the Nation Conservancy. So I won't walk through all these, but you might be working, for example, on land protection, forest protection. There you're minimizing a future risk, right? That the forest will get cut down, developed for agriculture, and that would increase future pollution for a city. You might be looking at assisted revegetation, so that's planting trees back where they used to be. That's a direct intervention that generally reduces erosion, right? If you target areas that are currently being very eroded. You could work on riparian buffers, similar strategy, it's working landscape strategy, but you're just trying to have a filter strip that's catching some pollutants before it makes it into streams. Or you could work on what are generically called best practices for productive landscapes. That might be erosion control, contour strips. It might be working with farmers so they don't over-apply nutrients. One in the western U.S. that's worth highlighting here is forest fuel management. This is one I know WRI and Todd Gardner has thought about in the West. In places with catastrophic wildfire, there's a risk of that big event occurring, and then if you get a rainstorm after a catastrophic fire, you get a very large pulse of sediment, which can actually shut down cities' water supplies. So it almost becomes like a discussion about insurance. You want to minimize that risk by minimizing fuel loads and the risk of a catastrophic wildfire. So if there's a lot of strategies for source watershed conservation, there's also a lot of reasons you do it. So if people engaged in this discussion probably hear lots of these arguments. Oh, source watershed conservation might provide jobs, it might help with rural development. And the Quito waterfront, for example, will claim several of these benefits. I'm going to focus in my talk just on this top one. So this narrower question of when is it in the cost benefit interest of a water utility to invest in source watershed conservation? I'm going to focus in on that because it's the focus of some of my research, and it's also often the first biggest step, right? It's convincing that utility that it makes sense to do this investment. And I sometimes call it defining the market potential. How much can source watershed conservation materially help the world's urban water utilities? And we started this in a way because I was sick of hearing the famous New York City story of, source watershed conservation helped New York save money. We wanted to know how many more New Yorks are there out there? How many cities is this a viable strategy for? What are the characteristics of watershed supplies that would make it viable? And to do that, of course, you have to have a sense of where cities get their water. This is DC, and we draw from Great Plains, so we have one watershed. Many cities have more complicated supply systems. So this is Rio and Sao Paulo's supply system with just straight lines connecting the source watersheds to the city. So the key point I want you to take away from this is that each source watershed has a different set of threats and a different potential for source watershed conservation to help. And different strategies in that list I showed you might be appropriate, more or less cost effective in each watershed. So it's actually quite a hard optimization problem, if you want to put it in that perspective. So one of my projects over the last few years has been mapping these sources for about 500 cities. And then in this urban water blueprint process, and this report came out a couple of years ago now, we wanted to take that information on about 2,000 water sources that are serving 500-something cities and intersect it with information on land cover change or on ecosystem service models of water provision or erosion and nutrient pollution to understand both the threats over time and then the potential for this suite of strategies, source watershed conservation, to help reduce those threats. So some take-home messages from that work, and some of this is in the paper I think you mentioned in the 2014 Global Environmental Change Paper. So cities, not surprisingly, once you understand this big network of infrastructure they create to reduce water risk, they build themselves out of water stress. So cities like Los Angeles that are in dry climates go out far enough to get water that they need. But even with infrastructure, a lot of cities, about a third of cities, still remain in what you would call water stress, which is defined here with this traditional ratio of withdrawal to available being above 0.4. About 380 million people are still in cities in that category, which collectively houses $4 trillion in economic activity. So this risk is important to the global economy, and it's likely to grow as climate change reduces or at least changes the timing of water availability. The other interesting thing when we looked at this question of where cities get their water is there's strong relationships with the level of economic development. So poorer cities, on average, have gone out not as far for water. They haven't been able to build as big supply infrastructures, and because of that, they're more likely to be in water stress. So I think that has implications for climate change as it goes forward. Poorer cities are less, they're going to be more vulnerable to climate change because they already have water supplies that are more stressed. It also has some implications for development. The poorest cities are also the ones growing the fastest. So we were talking about it this morning, there's a bit of a race. Very fast-growing cities are going to have more capital to expand their infrastructure to get more water. But on the other hand, they're starting off with often insufficient infrastructure that's leaving them more water stressed than rich countries. So that's a bit of the race to providing water for those extra 2 billion urban dwellers. So jumping into some results from the Urban Water Blueprint, we looked at the 5 strategies up above. So not that whole list I showed you earlier, but just these 5. About 700 million people are in cities that could benefit from at least one of these conservation solutions in a significant way. So we define significant here as a 10% reduction in sediment or nutrient emissions. Agricultural best management practices are the strategy that has the most scope, which is not surprising. The ag sector is the world's biggest source of pollution, so it's also where there's the most space to reduce pollution into urban source watersheds. In a sense, you have to work on a lot of land. So to hit that 10% reduction target in all the source watersheds, you have to work on about 6 million hectares, which is a lot of land. The other way to think about that, though, is it's less than 1% of the supply watersheds for the cities we looked at. So it's actually fairly targeted from a different perspective. Most of the pollution comes from 10 or 20% of the ag production in the watershed. So often quite targeted interventions can make a big difference. So the final big finding of the report, we had data for about 130 cities on how they treated their water and their water treatment costs. And it is statistically related to the level of pollution coming in the way you'd expect. So dirtier water sources, you have higher O&M, higher capital costs. You can build a model that says when is the ROI greater than 1 to do source watershed conservation? When did the benefits in terms of reduced treatment costs, in this case, outweigh the cost of conservation? And that's true for about 1 in 4 cities. So, how many more New Yorks are there? There's actually a fair number out there. Clearly, many more cities could do this strategy than are doing it now. Maybe in the discussion section, we can talk about some of the other governance or finance barriers that are stopping cities from reaching that potential. I listed some of the governance issues on the left, on the right, sorry. On the left here is the hydrologic features that make your ROI higher. Small is beautiful when you're doing this work, and it seems in retrospect like an obvious conclusion, but we didn't know this going into work. Small source watersheds, it's easier to do conservation on the aquifers to change pollutant concentration. Big source watersheds, like picture St. Louis drawing from the Mississippi, it's very hard to work at a scale that will meaningfully change pollutant concentration. The other bullets here are things we drew from a literature review or from experience TNC's had in the field. Having less people, less landowners in the rural area helps. It's easier to set up a transaction. It helps if there's a large city, so there's more willingness to pay from the water utility. And less complex water treatment plants are more sensitive to raw water quality. So by the time you're out in the limit, like a membrane filtration water treatment plant, you are less sensitive to changes in raw water quality because your O&M and your capital costs are already quite high. So check out, if you haven't, the Urban Water Blueprint website. There's figures like this that try to rank cities globally for where specific strategies have the best scope. This is agricultural BMPs to reduce phosphorus. And then we try to get into the variation within cities. So this is a picture for Beijing. When we did the report, Beijing was mostly groundwater dependent, but had 5 surface water sources. And they each have quite a different cost effectiveness of how much source watershed conservation can help. And even within a watershed, there's an investment curve, right? So you can start in certain places that will give you a high bang for your buck. If you want to continue on to a 20 or 30 or 40% reduction in phosphorus, it gets progressively more expensive. So I always want to end by saying what the strategy, what this report is good for and what it's not. It was meant as a conversation starter and this ballpark estimate of the size of the market for this conservation strategy. It's often close to what more detailed models say, but the global report is not meant to be investment grade information. You don't go in and design a watershed intervention just on that. So an example is we prioritized Albuquerque's water supply from the Rio Grande as one of the places where you might want to work on reducing forest fuel risk. Our chapter there had also been working on this theme with the Forest Service and other academic partners with much more complicated fire models. And, ballpark, at least as order of magnitude, our estimate of the number of hectares you'd have to work on to get to a 10% reduction in sediment risk is similar. So that's what the urban water blueprint is useful for, and what TNC is using it for is that first conversation with the mayor where we say, look, this probably has potential. This is about the order of magnitude of money we're talking about. Can we scope this out more with you? That's the appropriate way to use this kind of analysis. So we tried to get a sense of how much money could you save if you did this everywhere you possibly could, not just in the 1 in 4, but in all the cities. You could save about $900 million in O&M expenses if you did conservation everywhere it was possible for these source watersheds. But it would cost about $18 billion to do it in all those places. These are annual bases, so you have to pay that amount each year. So obviously, to do conservation everywhere in source watersheds that conservationists might want to, utilities can't pay for all of that. And you get into a discussion about co-benefits. What are the other benefits you might get from restoring ecosystems? Who are the beneficiaries there? And particularly for large basins, you get into a discussion of collection action problems. So when you have multiple cities drawing from one basin and multiple stakeholders in, say, the Mississippi River, our math suggests that there's no way that any one utility is going to foot that whole bill, even if collectively, on paper, it might add up to a solution. So I wanted to list a new tool in this space that's worth checking out. So we got a lot of questions. People said, well, why didn't you do my city or my city's supply? So we essentially did the urban water blueprint analysis for every watershed globally. And so you can just click and extract the information for your social watershed. So it's worth checking out if you work in this space. All right, so that was my quick tour of the urban source water. I'm going to touch on 2 types of natural infrastructure before I close up here. 2 more. This is really close to your building. Does anyone want to guess where that is? It's DDOE, it's right over there. And this is their green infrastructure installation. And I love this picture because it's doing what it's supposed to do. There's water, and it's infiltrating that water down. And I actually think it's a really pretty installation. And if it's pretty, the problem it's supposed to solve is really ugly, right? This DC, like 700 plus cities, when it rains hard, dumps raw sewage from our combined sewer system, which is not only gross, like I bike by the outfalls near the Kennedy Center, it smells really bad. It's also illegal. So the city gets fined and is under consent decree with the EPA. There's another 3,000 or so US MS4 systems, so separate stormwater and sanitary systems, that are also under consent decrees or enforcement orders with EPA for violating the Clean Water Act. So this has turned into a really huge problem for US cities. Often the gray infrastructure solution alone is very expensive. And so they're turning to natural infrastructure, more often called green infrastructure in this context, to help reduce stormwater infiltrating into the system. And so the reason is shown in this cartoon, again for the hydrologists in the room, excuse how crude this is. So DC would naturally be forested, and so a big chunk of the water would go up as evapotranspiration or infiltrate down into the soil, and only a little bit would go off as surface runoff. What you do when you develop a city is you increase asphalt pavement, much less evapotranspiration, much less infiltration, because those surfaces are usually not permeable, and much more runoff that then runs into the stormwater system. So the idea behind those pieces of green infrastructure, like the one in front of DDOE, is to restore some of the ecosystem services that the forested ecosystem would have naturally provided. So dozens and dozens of cities are doing this. There's at least 10 cities that TNC's usually involved in this process. I don't know if anyone's done a complete geography of where cities are trying to use green infrastructure for stormwater. It's a big growth area. I wanted to highlight DC in this talk, and I highlighted it in my book, because I think they have an interesting policy solution that's trying to solve one of the challenges for this type of national infrastructure and for all of them. National infrastructure is usually a distributed technology, particularly this one. So you need action by lots and lots of landowners on their private property. What DC has tried to create with their stormwater retention credit market is a market analogous to the wetland mitigation market. So the way it works in DC now is there's a stormwater retention standard for new developments of a little more than an inch of rainwater on site for 24 hours, I think. If you can't meet that on site, or you choose not to, because you're going to develop lot line to lot line, you can buy a stormwater retention credit from someone else in the district who does. So TNT is interested enough in this that we're actually placing a bet on it. We borrowed money, and then we're building green infrastructure to try to trade stormwater retention credits on the market. At least that's our plan. We haven't put a shovel in the ground yet.
And Rob, do you know that Evan Bernowski, who runs that program for DDOE, as a former WRI staffer, used to run our Chesapeake Bay water trading program?
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay, so the head of the program has a relationship with the program. It's great. So it's a neat system. We'll see if it works. There's some challenges, right, from a hydrologic perspective. DC is part combined sewer system, part MS4 system, and the trading bubble is the whole city. So in principle, you can develop a big condo downtown, make the CSO system worse downtown, but buy a credit from someone in the MS4 system, which is hydrologically completely unconnected, right? So it's a good example of how policymakers often need a simple, tractable system to create a market that is also different than the reality, which is the green infrastructure piece here is often 10 times better or worse in terms of liters avoided than it would be over here. All right, this is my last sort of story of national infrastructure. And I'm starting with maybe the most unnatural place in the world. This is Penn Station in New York, which is one of my least favorite places. Also, is probably the ugliest train station serving a big city anywhere in the world. So it's a very fast-moving place. So I grew up in Atlanta. Even DC feels fast-paced to me, but New York City feels really fast-paced to me. There's 600,000 people that pour in and out of this station every day, and it feels stressful to me. I don't know what you guys feel when you go there. And in fact, there's been a lot of research recently that life in a city is psychologically really hard for us. Interacting with a lot of people raises people's stress, raises cortisol levels, and it causes a set of psychological problems. The irony, though, is it's this interaction that makes cities work, right? And this is why there's more than 2 billion people moving into cities. Economic innovation goes up in cities, productivity goes up in cities, and so there's this interesting trade-off. We are moving to cities because they promote interaction, and somebody once called, Aristotle, I think, once called us the social animal, right? We like to interact with each other. So we're creating these perfect spaces for interaction, but ones that are also psychologically hard for us. And they're arguably psychologically hard because we evolved in places like this, right? So in your whole life, in a hunter-gatherer group, you might relate to 200 or 300 people. So in Penn Station, I looked up the stats, you will cross paths with 200 people in about 5 minutes, typically. So that's the psychological stress, and so there's a whole body of psychology here I'm not going to do justice to now, called ART theory, attention response theory, that argues that a little interaction in a place like this, in a park, is a restorative break for your psyche. And so that wouldn't be a surprise to Olmsted. I think he was writing in that sense when he designed Central Park. But what's new now is a set of science that lets you quantify from social media data, for example, you can quantify visitation of parks globally in a much more accurate way than you ever had. There are studies that school kids, if they have a short break in nature, do much better on tests. This is true for adults as well. There's a fascinating set of studies for hospitals. Hospitals are nice to study because patients are often, in fact, randomly assigned to rooms. Patients with a view out of nature actually recover faster. They have less days in the hospital. There's another fascinating set of studies from the Chicago housing projects. Again, it's fascinating to researchers because people are kind of randomly assigned to apartments, effectively. And apartments with a view out of nature have better marital harmony. There's less domestic violence. People are reporting better happiness in their lives. So we now can say to Olmsted's sort of generalizations about nature being a respite in the city that there's something really empirically true there. We can quantify it. And I think that's important at this moment when we're urbanizing an area the size of the state of Texas to say, hey, maybe we're going to get all those benefits of interaction, but we want to capture some of these ecosystem services too. And so that's kind of the end thought I want to leave you with, reflecting back on McKibben's idea of the end of nature. In a sense, he's right. If you mean nature with a capital N, wild areas truly impacted by humans are rare, and that's still the province of conservationists. My organization, the Wilderness Society, the Sierra Club, still wants to protect those passionately. But we're going to mostly be living in cities, and we have to think about what role nature's going to play in that urban century, and which of these paths we want to go down, the LA River path or that sort of Korean Chongkichang River path. I really believe that it's a choice that society has to make, and we are going to choose the world we get, and we're going to get the world we deserve. And so that's what motivated me to write a book about all these different benefits that nature can provide to cities, is the hope that longer term we can have a greener, sort of more thriving urban future. So I will stop